place, and it's a paradise. Next. So the Aloha State. Maybe people wanted to buy land to invest. Next. But between the 1850s and the 1950s, sugar was the single most important industry. Whoever controlled sugar controlled the islands, and the different kinds of ethnic groups, like my ancestors, on my mom's side, her parents took the family to Colorado. So she was actually born in Colorado near Denver, and then her parents returned to Japan, took her with them, and in the 1930s she decided she didn't want to stay in Japan, so she left on her own and went to Hawaii, where she met and married my dad. His parents had left Hiroshima Prefecture, and they were merchants there, and started a branch merchant company on Kauai in Hawaii in 1893. So my family's been there for a very long time, and so I'm a third generation Japanese American. But in that period between the 1850s and 1950s, sugar was made. Whoever controlled sugar was, and so these people, the folks who controlled sugar, were Europeans or Americans, white Americans, who took over influenced the government, the Hawaiian monarchy, next, and eventually created an oligarchy of its own. So there is actually a term in Hawaii that we use that originally was used for any kind of foreigner, haole, which now refers only to Caucasians, because that was the group that eventually formed the oligarchy there. And so you had Asian laborers and Native Hawaiians who formed the laboring population, but that population diminished very rapidly. So Asians were imported as cheap labor, Chinese first, Japanese later, Koreans for a while, Filipinos, and in between, the Portuguese were imported from Portugal, and some Spanish, and they became kind of a middle level occupational group, and they often became luna, or overseers, field overseers, and so they became the interface between the Asian workers and the haole bosses, and were, as a result, I'll read you one or two poems about them if I can find them. They became very much hated because that was the group that was seen as being oppressive towards the Asian workers. So as you can see, the housing conditions were pretty primitive in the early period. Next. And the work was very difficult. Sugar plantation work is labor intensive, and particularly before mechanization. And Ted mentioned the fact that huli work was done before, sometime in the 1920s, the plantations discovered by accident that you could burn the fields and get rid of the leaves and reduce the amount of work that was required by quite a bit. So if you look closely, you can see that the cane is pretty blackened and charred. Of course, that didn't make it wonderful for people who had to cut the cane and then carry it, because you got covered with ashes from morning to night. And the women who were assigned the work of cutting the weeds, or hohana in Native Hawaiian, and hole bushi, because it was considered to be less arduous. But as you can see here, they also did cutting of the cane and carrying these bundles. So the women who did, some of the women were stronger than the men, by the way. So they used to have contests to see, the way lumberjacks do. Many people will do this, or try to see who can type faster. So people take their work that they have to do and turn it into something that excels, that shows who's the best at it. And next. And I remember reading about one contest where one woman, they had, they'd have a pile of cane over here, and then a scale over there, and so they'll be in 10 minutes or 20 minutes how much you can bring in. People would carry tons in that period of time, and so this woman beat all the men in at least one of those contests. So it was really interesting to see. And you had a variety of, by say 1900, after the first 15 years of immigration to Hawaii, there were maybe 90,000 people of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii, and they were over half of the plantation labor by then. So the Japanese in Hawaii became the single largest ethnic group very quickly from 1900 and into the 21st century. So, which is why you have those of you who know about the political history, people like Senator Inoue or Senator Matsunaga, that in fact a lot of the political representation from Hawaii has included people of Japanese descent. That it's the single largest group. So when democratic politics entered Hawaii after World War II, the Japanese became very important in the political process. They did, of course, a lot of different things, including, I think this particular slide includes women who are carrying firewood. You can see the amount of coverage. The sugarcane, Ted alluded to the fact, if you ever have been in cane growing country, how many of you have been, know what it looks like? Okay, so you know it's horrendous. I mean, the cane can grow to 10 or 12 feet tall, and if you try to walk into that stuff, it is really amazing, because there's centipedes and scorpions and snakes and lizards and everything else in there. But it's dusty and hot, and so to prevent yourself from getting bites, and the cane leaves have very sharp edges. So to keep yourself from being cut and mangled, the workers devised clothing that basically covered their entire bodies. And because it was hot, it was very uncomfortable, but it was better than being cut to pieces. Yeah.
When was the head made of?
Oh, all kinds of. Could you go back? I think that was probably from the coconut leaves that they weave together. Okay. Well, of course, eventually the Japanese also went into the towns and created urban communities in places like Hilo or Wailuku on Maui or Honolulu. So by the time you got to the place where in the early 1900s people were creating ethnic communities in the cities and in the towns, you could really get a sense of people creating these songs in the cane fields and thinking back to where they had come from, what they had done. Some of them never made it. I mean, they went in order to make money and go back to the villages, sometimes to be able to try to repurchase land they had sold. And maybe we can play the next one.